is Monica Mallon. I'm a transit advocate and rider from Santa Clara County, and today I'm just going to be talking a little bit about how I became a transit advocate and how you can too. So I'm going to be telling my story, giving some advice, and answering questions. I really do want to spend a lot of time on Q&A, so please leave any questions that you have in the chat. It could be about absolutely anything. Nothing is really off limits here. I really want to help make all this less intimidating so that you can all become amazing transit advocates in your communities. So just, a little bit about me. I'm 23. As I already said, I live in Santa Clara County, and I'm a lifelong transit rider. So I started taking transit when I was really young, and I've never owned a car in my life. So transit has just been such a big part of my life and such a big part of my success, throughout my entire lifetime. So my first real introduction to transit advocacy didn't actually happen until I was 19 years old. I was going to college on the bus as usual, and someone there told me that they're proposing to cut most of the bus service in my neighborhood. And I was a broke college student at the time, and buses were cut. Things were going to be really hard for me financially. So I asked what I could do, and this person had told me that there was going to be a VTA outreach meeting coming up that we could go to and speak up at. So, I decided to go to this meeting. I did not know anything about transit advocacy or transit policy or how a VTA worked or any other transit agency. I was very, very new to all of this. And I think that's something that a lot of people can resonate with too. You really don't know how to get started, and you really don't know what to do. And I was really lucky to have people guiding me and all of that. So anyways, ended up going to this meeting, found out that there were a lot of other people that were concerned too. We spoke up, and we actually ended up saving some of those routes. So this was my first advocacy opportunity ever, and actually ended up achieving a little bit of success. So, during the time I was in college, I also started working in transportation and management at San Jose State. So I was working with other students, trying to get people to take transit. TDM is an amazing job. It's something that I would highly recommend to people. It's really fun. One day we got an email from VTA, which is our local transit agency, saying that they're going to cut one of our most popular bus lines. So I was obviously really upset about this. I knew how much the route helped our students. Transit advocacy to me is really personal for myself as a rider, and also, to the community as well. So that's really my driving force in all of this. I asked my boss at the time what we could do, and he said that I should go to the VTA board meeting and make a public comment and speak up for the students. As I've said, I've been really lucky to have people that have been willing to help me navigate the confusing world of transit advocacy and policy, and he was really one of those people. So helped me pull some of our ridership data, write my public comment, and I ended up going to county building for my first ever transit board meeting. When I got there, I was really intimidated. All of the board members were sitting kind of like up on these raised seats, and then there's kind of an audience. So there's already that divide, and you can actually find a picture of me from that day on my Twitter. I just posted something from then. And, I really noticed that everyone there was so much older than I was. I was like 20, 21 at the time, and most people were 40, 50, 60 years old. So I was really intimidated, didn't really know what to do. There weren't really any clear directions, but I found someone that worked at VTA, and I asked them what to do, and they helped me out. My comment card, so sat down, was like going over my speech, going over my comment. I was really, really scared, really intimidated, probably shaking, especially by the time I got called up. But, I pushed through all of that. I messed up a few times, but, it did feel good to stand up for my community. And, to anyone out there that's just getting started, we're all scared the first time that we make public comments. That is completely fine. That is completely normal. A lot of us that are more experienced and more known in the community, we have to act confident when we're, presenting in places on Twitter, because a lot of this really is about confidence. But we all get scared. We were all scared at first, and we still are today. So yeah, that's really something that I do want to emphasize. So yeah, so I ended up staying for that transit board meeting, and as it went on, I really started to realize that I was the only member of the public that cared enough to show up, which was just really, depressing to me. I cared so much about transit advocacy, and I always assumed that other people were more involved, but they really weren't. And it was really something that made me realize that if I didn't stand up and do something, no one else would. And I want to mention this specifically, to give people that are living in areas where there isn't strong transit advocacy hope. You can absolutely start from pretty much nothing at a young age and still, be able to achieve success and build that transit advocacy up, and either bring it back or start something completely from scratch. So, after going to that meeting, I decided that I was going to try to learn as much as I possibly could and become a transit advocate. So I started going to VTA board meetings and committee meetings and reading about transit history at the library and talking to everyone, that I could find that knew about transit that was willing to talk to me. And, this is something that I'd really recommend to people that are just getting started. There are a lot of resources out there. There are a lot of people that you can learn from. When libraries open up again, your local library probably also has a lot of great resources there. So yeah, around that time, I also started getting involved with neighborhood associations and educating people in my community. That's something else that I would really suggest. Sometimes people just have no idea what's going on with transit or what they can do. I mean, I was in that position myself, and I would have been able to benefit from someone coming, to school club or something and presenting on that. So I really tried to become that person and provide that resource. So, started getting more people in my community involved, especially because more transit cuts were being proposed, and I really started to slowly build that community and slowly, get to a point where people were understanding what was going on and people were advocating and people were showing up to, VTA board meetings, and I wasn't the only person there. I also started to get to know the board members more, and this is probably if you know me from Twitter, you know me from anywhere, you probably know me from this situation. So yeah, one of the board members, had kind of been talking about this idea of shifting funds from one of our sales tax measures from highways to transit operations. She was actually the chair of the board when they put this measure on the ballot, but had kind of realized that she made a mistake and was interested in correcting that. So thought this was a really good idea. I started bringing people to the VTA board meetings to speak, talking to climate groups, because obviously, it's something that they could really get behind. At this point, I was maybe getting, 5 to 10 speakers at meetings, nothing too exciting, nothing to the point where anybody was really going to do anything. But then one day I was at an event and I was talking to that same board member, and she challenged me to bring 100 people to a board meeting to get a referral to actually have staff spend time to look into shifting funds, because with transit agencies, normally you have to actually get a referral to have them look into what you're interested in. So I took what you said pretty literally, went home, made some flyers that are actually behind me right there. And I contacted every organization, every neighborhood association. Didn't even really matter what they focused on. I just wanted to get this out there. So I spoke everywhere that I could. After I was working 2 jobs and going to college during this time. So, every night I was on the bus for hours going to all of these meetings. And it was just a really, really cool time because I was really able to, get this information out there, educate people, and also get people excited about improving transit, because this was really our first opportunity to improve transit in a while. So it was a really cool experience. Ended up getting more and more people to show up to these meetings month after month, getting more and more people to, be talking about this in the community and spreading awareness. And finally, I ended up getting, I think, about 40 people, which was enough for a referral. She was joking about bringing 100 people. That probably would have made the meeting take way too long. And this was really one of the first times where the community was really standing up for themselves and was able to get a referral in a grassroots way. It was really, really cool to be a part of that. And those of you that know me know that the story doesn't have a positive ending. Things ended up getting political, and there's a lot of drama. If you want to learn more about this, you can Google my name. But there was a lot of tension, not necessarily a super fun experience. I got threatened by some really powerful people, and I ended up doing things that I'm not really proud of, and we ended up losing. But I learned from that experience, and I became more pragmatic. And I ended up starting fresh with Turnout for Transit, which is a new transit group that's focused on preventing cuts at PTA. And I've tried now to get less into the political nature of all of this and to really try to focus on things that are a little bit more feasible. But I'm still learning and growing and making mistakes and trying my best. And that's really all that we can do. There's not really any science to this. I wasn't able to present slides on specifically what you can do to make transit better and to be a good transit advocate, because there's no recipe to that. And there's also often a lot of luck involved. Sometimes it's just about being in the right place at the right time, or the right Zoom call at the right time, just who or who's on these boards. But there absolutely are things that you can do to help out. So yeah, that's just a little bit about my story. Now I really do want to answer any questions that you all have. It can really be about anything. It can be about getting started with advocacy, organizing in the world of Zoom, or anything else that's happened. Okay, is there a formal organization for your area that promotes public transit participation? Pittsburgh is lucky to have two. So we don't have any funded transit advocacy organizations where I live, unfortunately. So it is a little bit tough, but we have Turnout for Transit, which is an organization that I started that's focused on preventing transit cuts. We have Friends of Caltrain. Those of you that know Adina, she's done a lot of great work with them. And then there's also a few other groups that kind of do a little bit of advocacy, but we don't have anything that's funded now. But it can absolutely be something that could happen in the future. And to anyone out there, you don't have to have a funded org to do positive things. You can absolutely do things, in a grassroots way. Funding does help you get to the next level, and it is extremely helpful. But there are still things that you can do if you don't have that. And then how connected is this landscape with Seamless Bay Area? It kind of depends on if you're talking about advocates or the agencies themselves. I would say that generally advocates are pretty supportive, but the agencies really aren't, and they aren't necessarily super supportive. But it's going to be interesting to see what happens over the next few years with that.
Hey, Monica, I have a question.
Yeah.
I've been on the receiving end of your advocacy, for good or for worse. My question is to you, how do you navigate the idea of being a younger person in a generally older public structure, whereas a lot of the people who come to these meetings aren't representative of the general public, the people who will benefit from this? It's usually older white people that are Prop 13 recipients or whatnot. How do you kind of be taken seriously? Like, what are good tips for someone who's young without being like told like, oh, you're just young, wait until you pay taxes, right? Like my dad used to tell me growing up. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's really been one of the biggest challenges for me has just been my age. And, I look a lot younger than I actually am. I'm 23, but sometimes people will even think that I'm younger than 18. So being taken seriously has been incredibly difficult. But, I think for me, the thing that's been the most helpful has really just been to, act like an adult and be more mature about things, not fighting with people, whether that's, on Twitter or at an actual meeting, and just really trying to stay calm and show that, you can be a leader without fighting. Also getting support from people that are older is something that's really helpful. Earlier I talked about kind of a situation where I was getting threatened by people, and thankfully I was able to have some people that were a lot older that were there to kind of back me up. But people will kind of be a little bit ageist towards young people in a lot of these situations, just because the people that are running these transit agencies are normally 50, 60, even older, and the same thing goes with transit board members. So you just have to kind of deal with it and make the best out of it, and know that your age doesn't mean that you don't have good ideas, or that you can't get things done, because you absolutely can. And now, at least where I live, most transit advocates are under 30 and are younger. So, it's something that you can absolutely do at any age.
Thank you.
Some of the other questions, how have you found virtual advocacy and organizing around transit for the last year or so? So it's been really interesting. It was actually really challenging at first, because at least for most of our agencies, they don't even say what agenda item it is on the Zoom. So I actually developed my own system to help people make public comments. So I actually use P2P texting from campaigns. People could sign up and get a text alert when the correct item was up and when it was time for them to speak. So that's been something that's been really helpful in just getting people to speak on the correct items. Also just to getting the information out through email to people on social media as well, has also been helpful, because it is a lot more accessible to people, but it's also a situation where if someone's new, they're not going to have those people there to help them, sort out any difficulties that they're having. Like, when I was talking earlier, I was talking about how I didn't know what to do when I went to my first board meeting, but there were actual human beings that I could talk to and ask for help. And that's not really the case with Zoom. So, I've really been trying to find ways, through P2P texting, social media, email, to try to communicate with people during these meetings and resolve some of the issues. And then in an urban area with too many individual groups, what's the best way to find out what groups are out there and evaluate a good one to join? I kind of have the opposite problem, but I would say, just try to look online, try to, see who's being quoted in articles about transit. That's a really good way to find people. And, to evaluate a good group, I think, seeing which groups are successful, and also just how they approach advocacy and how that aligns with your values. There are certain groups that I'm not really involved with anymore because they were really negative and they were, involved in a lot of fighting. So, it's really about finding a group that is going to be successful, but also that aligns with your values. Is it better to join a smaller group with a unified purpose, or try to influence a larger, more established group? It really kind of depends on what the structure is of the existing group. I mean, I would say if they're really stuck in their ways, then it's completely good to start a smaller group and start something new. But it's always worth a try. You can try to go to the more established group, see what they say, see if they're receptive, and if they aren't, definitely don't be afraid to go to a smaller group or even start your own group. It's a good idea to have everybody that's involved in advocacy have a unified voice, but sometimes that's not completely possible. Have you encountered condescension from boomers, men / male boomers in advocacy? In advocacy, there just aren't really that many people that are involved in advocacy. But yeah, it has happened, a few times, and I just kind of have to deal with it and move on. But I think as an advocate and as a leader, when this sort of thing happens and you're and younger people are hearing this, new advocates are hearing this, high school students are hearing this, I always do make a point to explain to them that that's not okay, and that they do deserve to have a voice in everything. How do we make sure that our advocacy orgs are inclusive to people of all backgrounds? I mean, I haven't really experienced that many different groups because there aren't a lot of groups here, but I always make sure to make myself really accessible to any questions or concerns that people have, and really give everyone an opportunity to talk as much as I can, and just really being that resource for people and doing outreach. This is a lot harder in the Zoom age, but before I would really try to, go to a diverse group of other groups and talk about transit and let them know what was going on. But now with Zoom, if some of these groups aren't meeting, there's not all that much that you can do. But I think really like making sure that the older boomers are not dominating these discussions, and knowing when to kind of say, that you need to have other people speak, and just really empowering, people from more diverse backgrounds, people that are younger, people that are actually transit dependent, making sure that you're uplifting their voices and saying, hey, what do you think about this? If the older people are talking a little bit too much. Um, who were some of the people that helped you the most, and how did they help you? So, at first I was kind of in a situation where there were a lot of people that were willing to give me advice, but weren't willing to advocate with me. So they kind of helped me in the sense of understanding how the advocacy process worked, understanding the history, understanding a lot more about budgets and finance, because I don't come from that background at all. So that was really some of the biggest bit of help that I got early on. And really another thing was just having people that believed in me, and having elected officials that believed in me as well. I remember at one of those earlier board meetings, I was making a public comment about, my story, and about how transit helped me, be able to afford to go to college and live in this area. And, one of the board members actually like got out of his seat and walked over and talked to me and said, I was really inspired by what you said. I want to help you and start pushing my colleagues on this. And, that was really something that meant a lot to me, because, it's really hard to do this, and to be young and to deal with all the things that, you have to deal with. So that's another thing. Also just having advisors and older people that can help you when you get into some of these more these situations with more conflict is also really helpful. Some of the local climate groups, like Sierra Club, Silicon Valley Youth Climate Action, Bay Area for Clean Environment, some of their leaders were really helpful in just being there at these meetings, because if you're young, you've been in a meeting with an elected official that doesn't really agree with you. Sometimes they're just going to yell at you for 30 minutes. And, that's really something that's hard to deal with. So sometimes having older people just in the room to back you up and to support you is something that's really helpful. Challenging question I'm wrestling with talking to lawmakers. What's your pitch to people that are transit skeptics? SC has a lot of tech books that are focused on autonomous vehicles and hyperloops. How do you win people over to invest in high frequency buses rather than shiny new things? It really has been a challenge here. I mean, I'm sure some of you have seen some of the articles about trying to build a hyperloop to the airport in San Jose. So that's really something that I have struggled with a lot. But in terms of transit itself, we have really big congestion problems and really big traffic problems. And what I normally say is that, if other people take transit, that is helpful. That's helpful for you. You're going to have less traffic and less congestion to deal with. So kind of presenting it as transit for other people, it's not the best thing to do, but that is typically what works. And then also for high frequency buses, instead of flashy capital projects, just really talking about the speed in which they can be implemented, saying that in, a couple of years, we could have, a lot more bus service. We could do some of these things and really start to get things back up to a reasonable level, is also sometimes helpful because people don't always want to wait, 10 to 20 years for BART or whatever the newest thing is. Are the cities and the operators very open from you or your organizations? Open to suggestions from you or your organizations? It kind of depends on the situation. Usually they're not very open to it, but you have to organize and really show them that it's something that matters to the community. But a lot of that just has to do with the fact that a lot of the transit advocates where I live are young, and we just don't get taken seriously because of age. Have you dealt with state or federal legislators regarding transit funding? How did they react to your views? Yeah, I have dealt with a lot of legislators, especially at the state level. Generally they do agree with me, but it's kind of hard to pass taxes right now, and that's kind of the main way to make transit better is to actually get money for it. But generally they have been respectful and open to what I have to say. But it's really important to recognize that this is a really difficult time to be generating new revenue. But it's still a good time to be getting people on board to support. What access practices do you use on social media? I honestly need to get better at this. I'm really not the best at social media or making social media accessible. So this is something that I really do need to work on, and I will check out the link that you suggested. Do you find that the issue is more about spreading awareness generally, or more specifically convincing others to support transit? It's really been a combination of both for me. At first people were just really unaware because we used to have funded transit advocacy, but the organization that was funding that pulled out the funding, pretty recently. So there just was not any funded transit advocacy, for a few years during that time period. So spreading awareness was really important, and it's something that I really dedicated a lot of time to. Generally, people are pretty supportive of the idea of transit. They might not be interested in taking it themselves, but I think you can really easily get people to understand that if other people are taking transit, that's a benefit for them. How do you depropagandize people who are over focused on gadget bonds, hyperloops, AVs, etc.? They are everywhere, and at least where I live, a lot of the people that are promoting these sorts of things are a lot older than me and are a lot more established. But again, really have to focus on the fact that we do have something called buses that can work and have been used for decades and decades and decades and can be implemented quickly. Talking about how bus lanes can happen quickly. Something we've also been working on down here has been, a lot of transit speed improvements. So really just focusing on the fact that we have something that works, we just need to do it. And also that it's just a lot cheaper and faster.
Sorry to interject. There's no one scheduled for the next 15 minutes. So if you wanted to just keep answering questions, you can, or you can, whatever. I don't know.
Yeah.
I just didn't want to say there's a time limit or like you have to get off soon.
Yeah, if anybody has any other questions about anything, more than happy to answer any of these.
Monica, how do you, for those that have worked for an actual transit agency or DOTs or things like that, what is your, recommendations to those that their job is transit and they push that, but yes, but they get pushed back against the transportation as far as driving car side. So how are you an advocate when you work within those parameters?
So meaning when the DOT wants to do something positive, but there's pushback from the community.
Right, because I've worked for DOTs, I'm working in private sector, but I remember developing, here's one example, a newsletter, to get things out to our agency, our groups, funding, all the things. And I put some quote about, biking, riding transit that someone made. And then months later, someone discovered it and I was told, I got reprimanded, take that out because, we are a transportation agency at the time, and also build roads. And I was kind of like, but we're a transit unit. So how do you deal with someone that they want to promote that, but, they kind of get, slapped on the hand for it or punched in the gut?
I mean, more recently, I've just really been trying to support, elected officials and the agencies themselves and, kind of help to prevent some of the conflict that happens. But, when it comes to that sort of conflict between congestion management, roads, car infrastructure versus, buses and bikes and pedestrian infrastructure, normally the thing that I say is that, sustainable transit, sustainable transportation is congestion relief. It is a long-term congestion relief that these people really want. If you add a lane to a highway, it's going to be a temporary solution, but it's not going to be something that's going to help, in the long run. So that's typically how I approach it. Just trying to explain to people that, that there are more sustainable ways to handle these congestion problems that are more cost effective. I'm not always effective. There are always going to be people that are going to disagree. But I try to build enough support so that the agencies will be willing to push some of these things. And then what's your experience, regarding horizontal consensus-based orgs versus more centralized hierarchical orgs? Most of the groups that I've personally been a part of are a lot more consensus-based. That's just because I was starting something from scratch and really wanted to, develop a vision and platform with the community. But I do have to work with some of these more hierarchical groups, to get resolutions passed or get support for things that I'm doing. And it is a little bit more challenging in the sense that, it can take a while to get things done. And, if the leadership isn't necessarily on my side, it can also be hard.
If there's no question in the chat, I had a question. So how do you, because the peninsula is kind of similar to Silicon Valley in the sense that there's a ton of cities and it's mostly suburban sprawl. So how do you navigate that in your advocacy, since there's so many entities you have to deal with? That makes sense.
Yeah, that's been a really big challenge. There's 15 cities in Santa Clara County, and there's also some pretty major unincorporated areas as well that are not in the middle of nowhere. So it's really just about trying to be in communication with elected officials and staff as much as possible, at these different cities and at the county level as well. And also finding people, within your organization or group that, can specifically focus on some of the cities, breaking them up so that it's not just you that's trying to talk to all of these people and handle everything. But, it's a really major challenge, especially when it comes to things like transit speed improvements. I actually met with BTA staff about that, at the beginning of 2020, and I was really excited about it. And I was like, what can I do? How can we make this happen? And they said, you have to go to all the cities in the county and get them to pass resolutions. And I was like, wow, this is really a lot of work. I started reaching out to them kind of in a systematic way. But then, the election happened. A lot of the people that I was working with didn't get reelected or were turned out. So it's really challenging if you're working in an area that has a lot of different cities, and especially if the transit agency isn't comfortable with, pushing stuff and they want you to do more work. But, you just have to do the best that you can with the situation that you're in. That's always what I say. It's going to be hard a lot of the times, but, doing something is normally better than doing nothing. And then how do we get more young climate activists to become transit advocates? For me, I just kind of randomly, met somebody and he was like, talking about how they're starting a youth climate advocacy org called Silicon Valley Youth Climate Action. And, it took me to one of the meetings and, met all the people there and presented there. So it's really, just about giving them the information and talking to them. A lot of people, a lot of the young climate advocates aren't necessarily focused on transit because they don't see that connection. So really talking about that connection, emphasizing that, transit is a climate solution, and also talking about electrification is usually something that helps as well. Are there any, I haven't been checking the hands. Are there any hands raised? Okay. As someone who's more involved with bike advocacy than transit advocacy, would you say that your relationship with bike groups is good, not great, neutral? How could bike groups be more supportive of transit advocacy given that we share so many high-level goals? Yeah, I mean, I would say that I have a pretty, neutral relationship with the bike groups here. They are, much more well-funded, at least right now, and they're generally more focused on city-specific issues, whereas I'm more focused on countywide issues. But if there are ways for us to work together, we absolutely do that. But I think that something in the future that could be helpful, and how bike groups could be more supportive, is really to try to find projects that do include both bike and transit, and or whether if it's on a measure, especially about measure, trying to join together and advocate generally for sustainable transit and transportation funding. There's been very little conflict. I really haven't experienced anything like that. But just I would suggest reaching out to them and talking to them. And even if they don't have the capacity to engage with transit and you don't have the capacity to engage with what they're doing, just checking in and keeping them, up to date is always a really good idea. So anyone have any questions that I haven't answered? I'm not sure if I missed some of these.
If there aren't any, I have like a really niche question. I kind of asked Adina the same thing. What do you think about BART annexation in Santa Clara County?
I think it's a really, really good idea. I'm not really sure if it's possible. I assume that BART would probably want some sort of property tax or some sort of tax to be passed. And I think that could be a challenge. And, anybody that knows the Santa Clara County elected officials, they're really about local control. Even my favorite elected officials, people that I really respect and work with, are a lot more in favor of local control than I am. But I really do think that it is, the right decision. It doesn't make sense that, we're building this extension separately, and then we pass our own sales tax, operate it, it just doesn't really make a lot of sense. Everything should just, all of the BART should be built, funded, and operated by BART. So I hope that something like that can happen. And it does, and if there is a measure for it, then I will absolutely be supporting it. How did you set up the notifications when relevant issues come up? So is this more for like notifying the community, or just kind of like getting notification myself for town halls? Yeah, so I mean, I check the agenda packets for everything that's relevant, you know, VTA, Caltrain, MTC, Board of Supervisors, you know, on a daily basis. It's one of the first things that I do normally when I wake up. So that's how I keep track of it. As far as community goes, I always do try to reach out to people as soon as I can. I have an email list for Turnout for Transit. We also have a Slack. So just let people know through that. And then, you know, if it is something that really does require more discussion, then, you know, always have some sort of meeting where everybody can learn more about the issue and talk about their views on it. You know, or if there are transit agency meetings that we want to participate in, kind of generally do the same sorts of things. Curious about how your view of biking as a transit mode or not. Here in Portugal, we're starting to actually see it more as another way to get moving as a part of leisure. Yeah, I think it can absolutely be a transit mode, be a mode of transportation to get places. But at least, you know, where I live, there's really a lack of infrastructure. You know, on my street, there's no protected bike lanes or anything, and the streets have really big holes in them. So I personally don't really feel safe biking in my area, but I think that if we really invest in that infrastructure and really make it safe, then it absolutely can be a transit mode. How big is your group? Have you launched any petitions? So Turnout for Transit has around 300-ish people. Silicon Valley Youth Climate Action also has around the same amount. And for petitions, generally we don't do petitions very often. We've done a few, but you know, generally we do try to get people to either reach out to elected officials and staff individually, send in letters, or speak at board meetings. Oh, yeah. So you look it up and send out text manually. Yeah, you know, I don't really have the patience to wait for the agencies to send out the emails, so I always like to get everything, you know, the hour early or whatever it is, and then send it out earlier. So that's always what I like to do. But yeah, most transit agencies do have some sort of notification where you can sign up to get alerts about agendas for specific committees or boards or topics. That is a really good way to go if you don't want to check everything manually. Is it better to push more for robust infrastructure like protected lane versus paint and risk failing, or is it better to settle for a small win, paint only with hope of improving it later on? I think it really depends on the situation. It depends on, you know, how much momentum there is in your area. If things are kind of in a downward spiral, then I would say you should settle for a small win and then try to improve on that later on. But, you know, if you do kind of have a lot of momentum and people are feeling a lot more positive, then I think it is time to push for something bigger and risk failing. But again, it just really depends on what the situation is where you are.